I think we're all set.
Okay. Good evening. This is a meeting of the Community Preservation Committee scheduled for Wednesday, June 17th, 2020 at 7:30 p.m. This meeting is going to be held by a remote virtual meeting, remotely held by Zoom. And there will be some preliminary matters that I will have to read into the record in order to accommodate this remote meeting. I am Peter Pingatore. I'm the chair of CPC. I would like to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. So we will do a roll call vote. I usually have my crib notes here, but I do it in alphabetical order. And let's try it. Joe Barnes.
Here.
Bob Dermody.
Here.
Laura Dorfman.
Here.
Artie Crocker.
Here.
Chris Gerstle.
Present.
Okay. And Rick Zambone.
Yeah.
All right, have I called, I think I've called everyone who are members of the committee. Are in attendance or staff members. When I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Karis Lustig.
Here.
Okay. And Kristen Wright. Kristen.
Here.
This open meeting of the Community Preservation Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12th, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of the public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will not feature public comment. And for this meeting, as I mentioned earlier, Needham CPC is convening by Zoom app as posted on our town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you, and that please take care not to screen share your computer, and anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All of the supporting meeting materials have been provided by members of the committee. They're available on our town's website unless we've otherwise noted, and the public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless I as chair note otherwise. We're now going to turn to the first agenda item. Before we do, I want to cover some ground rules in order for us to have an effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. I will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, I, as chair, will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Hold until your name is called. And remember to mute your phone or computer when you are not speaking. Remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. And for any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. So that's important to state your name. We need your name on the record. Each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. First matter on the agenda are the chair's updates.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that you took attendance before I got here, and I just want to let you know that I am here.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I will note for the record, and Paul, remember, state your name. This is Paul Alpert, right? So state your name.
Alpert. Yes, Paul Alpert is in attendance.
And yes, okay, good. Thanks, Paul. All right, chair's updates. I'm here and I'm chairing the meeting, which must mean that I was appointed as by the moderator. And so I was appointed by the moderator and I was sworn in yesterday by Teddy Eaton. I gave a very short speech at that time and I didn't want to trouble you guys with having to attend. Okay. All right. Next item on our agenda is a review of potential church funding conditions. That is a reference to the terms and conditions that as a committee we had discussed and attaching as a general way. And I call them business terms to be turned over to the attorneys in connection with any proposed funding for 2001 and 2002, 2020-01, 2020-02 applications by First Baptist Church and First Parish Church, respectively. Way back when you had in your materials a document called Suggested Contract Discussion Points. I don't know if you have your files with you and if you have them, but that's kind of the document that we were going to discuss. If you don't have them with you, that's okay. I have a copy, I think, and Rick is the one who drafted it, and I'm sure Rick has a copy. And now I see it end up, and it's Bob Dermody.
Would you allow the committee at your discretion a moment just to dig that out of our email files?
I can also,
Absolutely, Bob.
I apologize. I can also post it.
Oh, great.
So if you give me 1 second.
And
Okay, we're going to post it.
get posted.
Screen share.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think what I would like to do with this is we've all seen this, but we've never had an opportunity to discuss it. And it was put together, as I mentioned earlier, by Rick. And so, Rick, how would you feel leading the discussion with respect to this document?
I don't have any problem with it. We circulated it and there were a bunch of comments. I'm not sure we made the changes that people talked about because we were talking about some language, particularly to agree to a payback provision. I'm not sure that was the appropriate term. And but all I would suggest we do is just to kind of read through these and you know, go one at a time. This is Karis's screen, so I've got my pointer on it, but it's not showing up on anybody else's but yours, right?
I can do that. Yeah, it's not showing up on mine.
Yeah, okay. So
Rick, can you speak up or raise the volume on your microphone?
it's the computer. My microphone has got as much power as it has. It's
Okay.
an old computer. So I'll try
Okay,
and
that's fine.
back it up a little bit.
Okay.
I was just going to suggest we go through each of the bullet items and see if people, the committee agrees, or if there should be some little language change, then maybe Karis can do it as we're walking through the document.
Okay.
On the first provision,
Yeah, all right. I think that makes sense, but I think we should just bear in mind that these are general business terms. And so, and then and they're good in the bullet format, but we're ultimately going to rely on our council, to turn them into the language that we want. So with that in mind, we're on the first bullet point.
I
Okay,
guess we just want to make sure that all the things are covered, right, Peter?
right, that's true. So do you want to, let's see, do we want to start with comments? Rick, do you want to start with any comments you have, and then we can go around the horn?
I don't have any comments on this. If somebody has some suggestions or additions or deletions, then fine.
Okay, why don't we do this? I can't see everyone, so because of the screen share, I don't think I can. Let's see if I can do this. Oh yeah, I can. Oh yeah. Okay, great. All right. So let's start with that first bullet point, and everybody, and whoever wants to speak can just actually raise their hand, and then I'll recognize you. You unmute, you announce your name, and then you speak. Does that make sense? So let's do the first bullet point. Raise your hand, and I think that there, Artie and Paul are kind of recused themselves from the discussion regarding this. Regarding each, that one recused himself from I think Paul recused himself from 01 and Artie recused himself from 02. Don't really know that it's fair to therefore mean that they indicate that they can't discuss this document, which would have an application, a universal application. So I'm going to show chairman's discretion and ask them to participate, operating in with the good faith assumption that they're commenting for purposes of the other and not for the benefit of the application that they feel that they had to recuse themselves. Does it make sense to? I don't know if that may be a distinction without a difference, but I think it's fair. Okay, Paul.
No, I was just going to say, I think that is fair.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
And your name, so do you have any comments on that, Paul?
No, only to say that I'm in full agreement with it.
Okay. Any other comments? Artie?
Just one. Again, I mean, well, two things. This document could be used for any structure in the town, and it doesn't even have to be the two religious projects coming before us. The only comment I had is, and maybe we don't want to act on this, but I believe at some point I believe someone made the statement that as far as the payback, is this really in perpetuity? Is it 50 years, 75 years? At what point are we really not going to claw the money back? Should something be in there? Is, like I said, is it 50 years? Or should anything be in there? But I know there was a comment made, so I want to bring it up. That's all.
Good. That's an excellent point. Does anyone want to make a comment on that?
I do.
Okay, go ahead. Joe Barnes.
I don't know whether I made the comment or not, Artie, but I would think a sunset clause of some sort should be considered, whether it be 5 or 7 years, that if in fact this money is used as we have been told it would be, and we're able to oversee that, that we pretty much not hold them liable beyond 5 to 7 years, that they had lived up to the expectation, and we kind of dropped the payback.
All right, anyone else wish to comment on that? Bob Dermody? Bob, you have to unmute.
Trying to do that. Thanks. Yeah. I agree with Joe, but I would extend it. And my basis and I don't have a number in my head yet. I'm thinking about it years. And my basis for thinking of a longer term is the value of the materials purchased. So sort of theoretically, when might it have to, say they own it forever, and then they need to renovate the pieces that we paid for, 10, 15 years down the line, I'd like to get our money's worth out of the lifespan of those materials. So if it's, 10 years they sell it and all that stuff is still valuable and good and working, I think the town is owed something personally. So I don't know how you write that into language, but maybe we could pick at least a longer number of years. Those are my thoughts for now. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so, Artie?
I would just, for some reason, I had a lot longer than certainly 5 or 7, even 10 years. I was heading towards more the 20. I would, thinking about it now, I would head more towards the 20 to 25 years. I don't think I'd want to do it. I personally, I don't think I'd want to do it any less than that. Personally.
Okay, we are getting a little bit in the weeds. Kind of granular about this. I think that what I would suggest is that I like the idea of it sunsetting. I've gotten some feedback from at least one select board member, kind of suggesting that towns aren't always built. We don't really have the apparatus in place to always remember the agreements are in place and how long they last. So a sunset provision was a welcomed idea. What I would suggest is 2 things. One is, I think that it probably depends on the particulars of the project, which is kind of going to Bob Dermody's point, which is, well, how much value is going to be added, and what's the useful life of whatever it is that we're participating in the purchase or installation of. And the second may be just a practical question that we probably should ask our council, which is, we're in agreement that there should be a sunset provision. We'd like to protect our asset maybe till the end, but we also want to be practical and rely on your advice. That's kind of how I would propose it. I know what I'm saying is, let's get a little input from our council. How do we feel about that?
I agree.
All right, let's hear from Rick. Rick, you got to hit your unmute button.
I got that. Mr. Chair, the more I thought about this, let's just assume for the sake of discussion that we're talking about a sum of $100,000, just to keep the numbers round. And when you look at the value of that 10 years out or 15 years out, by the time it gets to 20, 25 years, $100,000 is de minimis. And so I'm thinking that, 10 years from now, that $100,000 may be worth a third of what it was, today. So if we're just taking back the cash, at some point, it's not worth even getting the claw back for that level of money. Just a thought.
Okay, so what is it that you're saying then? Are you saying that it shouldn't go beyond 10?
Time frame,
Pardon me?
I think the suggestion that was made of 20, 25 years, by the time we get to that point, 20 to 25 years, the value of the $100,000, may not cover Kristen's petty cash slip for that week. So
Okay.
I just, it's the value of the money that I'm questioning, is how much at a certain point in time, when is it not worth it? More than,
All right, let me recognize Paul Alpert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm beginning to have second thoughts about my supporting this provision, because now I'm thinking, what is it that we're looking to preserve? What are we paying for? We're paying for preserving the building. We're not paying for preserving a church. And if the building is sold by the church, let's say they sell it to somebody who preserves the outside of the building, but creates a condominium inside or creates a restaurant inside. I don't see why we need to be paid back as long as the building, the structure of the building, which is the historic provision piece that we're preserving, remains intact. And so I'm not sure that we should be saying that we get paid back just because the building is sold or they use it for a different use. I think as long as the building is not torn down, as long as the historic nature of the building is preserved, we don't get paid back. And then I think something like 10 years would be sufficient. Just for that. So that's where my thinking is right now.
All right. So sorry for the barking dog in the background. One of the reason why we did the clawback provision was we were looking for an elegant solution, excuse me, to the fact that these buildings do not have historic preservation restrictions on them. So, and what we were concerned about was putting money into a building where this is a not-for-profit, where we don't have a historic preservation restriction on it. And in fact, we don't, with these churches, we're assuming we're going to enter into some sort of good faith provision where we're assuming that there's going to be public access to it, as there is in the normal course of their business. That if it does get sold, then they would kind of reap the benefit of our investment, but we wouldn't have any protection for that investment if there is no formal historic preservation restriction on it, which there is not. Different document entirely, different process entirely. And there's no actual express provision that says the public has to have access to your building. That's why we did a clawback. It's also why we tried to put we want to put a sunset provision in it so that it's, as I said, an elegant solution and a simple solution, which limits our entanglement, which is so that we don't run afoul of the anti-aid amendment in the Kaplan case. So I think you just got to keep that in mind, Paul. We're kind of threading the needle and we're trying to do different things with this agreement. Okay. Does that help? Does that change your mind at all, Paul?
No, but I think it's something that we're going to be discussing and not make a final decision for a few more
Okay.
meetings. So
Okay. All right. So
something to think about.
for now, why don't we say that we're in general agreement with this bullet point? We have what's an open discussion might be the length of that we want a sunset provision on the clawback. We have some question about how long that sunset provision should be. Karis, your hand is up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, it's fine. I just add that these two particular projects happen to be on the exterior of the building, so the public benefit is in the retention of the historic structure for other people to see. We did have a request before for an internal structure, in which case the ownership of the building, that might matter compared to these projects. So I think it makes sense that these particular projects, the benefit, as long as they don't dismantle the exterior structure, is still there regardless of who owns it. I think if you're looking for something a little bit broader that could be applied to like something else, like I did have somebody approach me about potentially like a museum or a reading room where you are looking at public access and they might be doing work internally. That's where I think you may run into the issue of ownership.
Okay. So way to take from that is that given that it's on the exterior, we would still be looking then for a restriction on we would address it, I guess, through the next bullet point, which is that the applicant agrees not to change or demolish the structure. Is that correct? Okay. Okay. So now, if that's the case, what you're suggesting, Karis, is that perhaps we don't need the first restriction on payback. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think the question is, are we looking for more of a general process, or are we looking for something specific to these two projects? So I think if you're looking for more general guidance, I think the first bullet has validity. I think if it's specific to these two applications, then I think it may be less important.
Okay, so let me address that, which is my understanding is that these were really, these are bullet points that we're trying to address with respect to these two applications. We have different tools in the tool bag, to protect us with other historic preservation applications. So if it's a privately held structure that doesn't have access to the public, and they want to do an exterior, they want their porch done at our expense, we still may want to insist on public access to the building of some sort. And so I think we want to employ different tools based on the different applications. And I thought what we were going to try to do with this document is to kind of drive forward the document that we think we're going to need to have in place for 01 and 02 in order for it to be cleared by our committee and put, if it is, and then put to the vote at town meeting. So with that in mind, so with kind of the focus of this, I think that's how I view it. With that in mind, I think bullet point 1 still on the agenda, still on the, we don't need a consensus tonight, but it seems to me, is that a bullet point that we want to put forward as a likely business term to our council? Yes, Rick.
Peter, just with respect to the bullet point number 1, now that I'm thinking back, the thought process when we put that together was, what would happen if 3 years, 5 years from now, they sold the building and a builder came in and tore it down and put a different structure, a house or something like that in its place. And that's where the concept was to be, if it were ever sold or used for another purpose, because you'd lose your architectural significance and structure. And as a result, if they did that 3 to 4 years from now, we'd have spent that money and we wouldn't have the benefit going forward. And that was the thought behind that.
So what I'm going to do after this is I'm going to talk to council and just get some guidance on what we can and can't do and what makes sense. But I think part of that is it's really about selling the building and altering the structure that would trigger the clawback.
Yeah, that's my.
Great. I think that makes sense. Okay, so I think we're done with that one, right? We're done with the first bullet point. Good. Well put, Karis. Thank you. Okay. The second bullet point, which is somewhat related, is the applicant agrees not to change or demolish the structure and to maintain the structure in accordance with its architectural and historic significance by the town. So again, Rick, that seems to me be now part of the first principle that Karis just articulated, which is we're concerned about what happens if the structure is changed. What we would want to do is be able to obtain a claw back our investment at that point, correct?
Yeah, that would probably, you could probably combine the two, or the attorney could combine the two somehow.
Right.
Okay, good. All right. All right. Can you, let's see, the third bullet point. Want to walk us through that, Rick?
Yeah, the purpose behind that provision was, first of all, we didn't want to be tied to a project that could escalate with issues or problems. And so the whole concept is that would be for a fixed amount and not a percentage of the project cost. So it would be 50,000, 100,000, whatever the number might be. And it would be the final numbers into the project. And I think Dave Davison talked about that at one point when we were going through these items. And he said that there are certain provisions that are kicked in when the town lends money or provides money to someone for their use under these things, and it would be kind of covered by those provisions, so that we didn't put our money in first and all of a sudden the project never got done. So I don't remember if that's something to do with the town procedures on that. Karis, do you know what, you remember what he was talking about?
I can ask him about it. I'm not as certain because most of the projects that we've done that have not been town projects have been smaller, or we've covered the cost. It's not, at least the ones that I've been involved in, we've covered the whole cost of the project. It hasn't been a combination of funds. So I can certainly check in with him and report back next meeting to see if we're already covered. And I guess if we're already covered, we wouldn't need to include that as part of the agreement.
Yeah, I thought they have to submit timesheets and invoices for material and stuff like that.
Sorry, yes, we don't pay in advance. We pay after the fact. So they submit invoices and proof of payment, and then we reimburse them.
Right, okay. So the project really has to be done. So we're kind of the last money in to cover our commitment. And that was really to that effect.
I think that those are really, that's covered, I think, in our standard operating procedure and getting reimbursement from the town on a CPA grant application. Wouldn't you say that, Karis?
So yes and no. We do require them to have made payment. We don't, the last money in, I don't believe has a standard practice. And I think also the project doesn't have to be finished. It's just that the invoices to the amount that we've appropriated have to be validated. So they could go for a reimbursement and not necessarily have the project completed because they might be using their own funds or something like that. So I think those are kind of the nuances that I'm not sure are part of our normal procedure.
I guess I would caution against trying to change what our standard operating procedures are for the town. But I think that I think we can express those as concerns. Does that make sense to you, Rick? And
Yeah, I think that the point was here is that you wanted to make sure that the project was finished, that we didn't get 60% completed and they submit invoices and we pay for it. And then for some reason, the proponent runs out of money and never finishes the project. So that's why last money in concept came about. The project has to be completed, has to be, you could always say, once the building inspector signs off on an occupancy permit, then they can submit invoices for material and labor. And they would get reimbursed that way.
so I think that Rick's concern, it kind of makes sense with respect to these two projects because they're private organizations that are applying for money. So it may be that we need a little more control regarding the timing of the funding. So sure, it's different when we're dealing with a government, other departments of the town, but these are private entities. So I'm kind of with him that that's an expressed concern. And I guess we'd like to just express it for our town council. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Peter, if I may, for a second.
Yep.
So in other project and past projects, it is much of like what Karis is saying, reimbursement. However, the timing of the project, if we approve funds that were specific to the function of what the CPC can fund, and they had to be done in the middle of the project after some things had been done, but before other things could be done to complete the project, then that was always a timeline that was taken into consideration as well. The work obviously has to be done and has to be completed and it has to match the things that we are allowed to fund. So the things in some of the church projects, we cannot fund, the hardscapes in the front, and we cannot fund the roof or whatever we decide we can and cannot fund dependent on eligibility. But if the roof has to get done before the shingles can get done, or if the shingles have to get done before the poles can get done, or the structure has to get done before the siding can get done, then you might have a problem with last in, last out, because the project might not be able to be completed until our portion of the funding or the things that we can fund by reimbursement are completed.
Okay, those are good. That's a very good point. So I guess let's bring it up as an express concern, but it may not be something that we can meet. That's a good point, Kristen. Okay. Let's see. The next bullet point, Rick, has to do with public uses and amenities, right?
No, the one before that.
Funds are in hand.
Must demonstrate that all funds are in hand and available. So in other words, they have to show us that the money's there.
Fine. I thought that makes sense. Okay. I think that's
The next one is
another express concern that we have to our council. Does that make sense?
So I would just say if we're going to be 3 and 4 might go together, and I might talk to council about them together, because if we're the last in and we have to have proof of a certificate of occupancy, then they've already paid for the work. So they would have the fund. So there's just some possibility that we could merge them together, if that makes sense.
Does to me.
It does to me as well. Okay. All right, and the next bullet point has to do with public access.
Yeah, and that was the fuzzy one that we weren't sure what was going to be there for the various projects, but there needed to be some public use or amenity, and that's just kind of standard language.
So that was kind of addressed by Dave Tobin, which was he cautioned us against in the entanglement with the churches, and so he advised us to make the document as simple as possible. Not that I don't think we're working against that with respect to the first few bullet points or 4 bullet points that we discussed. But what he was concerned with is the language in the Kaplan case about entanglements between the town and the religious organization. And so he cautioned us against this kind of provision with respect to the religious organizations. I think that the way that in my head that was working around, I was thinking that, well, with respect to the churches, they open their doors to the public every day. And it also gets back to the other issue, which is, and it gets back to 2 other points, which is these are outside and facade, right? These are facade provisions. So it may not be that important with respect to the churches. And it may be something where our council is advising us not to do it, just with respect to this. But I think that is one tool that we should always keep in mind as we go down the road, and there are additional applications from non-government organizations for historic preservation funds. I don't know that we should be pushing that very hard on this one. It could be that we could have some broad language, could have some good faith language, some understanding in the provision and in the agreement that they're going to continue to, when they function as a church, they're going to continue to open their doors to other organizations for use of the premises. Some language like that, almost aspirational, good faith language. That makes sense. Anyone? And Bob.
Yeah, Bob Dermody. I agree, and I want to thank Paul. I think this is a very good way to look at this. That the monies that we potentially would fund are for exterior structural, edifice kind of things. And so I think an early argument was made that is the benefit to the townspeople right there, that they can see it. So I just wanted to thank Paul for that. I think that's a very helpful way for all of us to look at this. And I'm now thinking of this, I was on the side of, we should get some public access, but that's not the point, I don't think, anymore. But I wouldn't want this to go away as a tool, as Peter says, in the future. I do like the idea, if it's possible, because the church has been very amenable to that, to share their structure, so to speak, with the town. So I wouldn't hold them to it in a legal document, but if we could have some kind of a good faith clause, I would support that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And Paul?
Yes, and so it's kind of project specific. At one time, the First Parish was coming to us for money to restore, I believe, an historic clock or an historic bell or something. I think it was an historic clock. And so this, in that kind of a project, this provision would make sense because it was, our thinking was that if we spent the money to refurbish the workings of this historic clock, we should be able to have like school outings for the school children of the town to see the clock and how it works and its historic significance. And so if this is a template for future use, yeah, something like that should be in there. And I think in the current projects, which is just for the exteriors, it's not necessary for these particular two. That's some of my comment on.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Anyone else? We have a sense, right, of that it's aspirational language, but it's not a requirement. And it is one of the tools in the tool bag going forward. Okay. And Rick, your final bullet point.
Yeah, this last bullet really was kind of to indemnify and hold the town harmless from any disputes. And what comes to mind is, for whatever reason, a contractor in the church, because they're the agent that's doing all the dealings with the contractor. A contractor in the church can't agree on some work provision, and the contractor sues them for whatever reason, lack of payment, anything like that. I'm not sure if it's standard language in the town's stuff, but if it isn't, it should be, to indemnify and hold the town harmless. And that's, lawyers like that language.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And again, it may not come up in the usual course because in other CPC projects, because we're usually dealing with different departments at the town, but here we're contracted. We have a private organization, and we don't want to get swept up into any dispute with the contractor.
Right.
We're giving the money. We're not a joint contractor with you. We have no responsibility, and you're going to indemnify us, right?
I do believe we enter into an agreement with the entities that we disperse money to. I'm not 100% certain what the parameters are, but we usually have indemnification as part of our standard contract. So I would imagine that would be in there as well, but I will double check.
All right, so now we've reviewed the bullet points that Rick put together for our review. Thank you, Rick. Does anyone have any other thoughts that they want to communicate in terms of business terms or any provisions that they think are important to be included in the proposed agreement? And now we're focusing on 01 and 02 of 2020.
Peter, it's Paul.
Okay, is that
Ask a
Laura?
question.
Laura?
Yes. And I've been trying to ask a question, but I don't think you've seen me because you can only see a certain amount of people on the screen.
Okay, so good. All right, so now I will recognize you, Laura. I apologize.
No, it's no apologies needed. And I apologize.
Are you raising? Wait a minute. Will you raise your hand? Let me see. Okay, yeah, that's kind of, now I can see it. Okay, okay. It may have to do with the position of the camera too, so that's okay. All right, go ahead.
You want me to? Okay. I'm sorry to go back to the first bulletin, but I have just a quick comment. The very first bulletin on Karis's, what Karis put up on the screen, and just that, might we consider the amount of what was granted when we consider what the clawback is? In other words, $5,000 versus $250,000 to me makes a big difference. And I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, I think that makes sense, and I think that that's kind of what Rick was pointing at too, which was he used
Okay.
1,000 as a benchmark, but that you put a different, maybe a different point. You've actually brought it to light in a different way. So that's and maybe more succinctly, which is we should consider the amount.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let's make sure the Karis will communicate that with our council. That's an excellent point.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And now, Laura, do you have any other comments on any of the other bullet points?
I do not.
Okay, all right. Okay, I do not have any additional provisions. And so I think with that, we can have Karis and I may get involved. Maybe I should, Karis and I can talk to our council and we can move the process forward from there. Okay, makes sense to everyone?
Yep.
Any further comments? No need to vote. Okay, so now we come to our next agenda item, which is a discussion on our follow-up to Emery Grover. The way we left it 2 meetings ago, so this would be our April meeting, was that I was going to put together proposed questions for the town concerning Emery Grover, and I had done that and distributed that document, I think, from our last meeting, and then our last meeting ran kind of late. So you should have that document in front of you. I think it might make sense to start with Karis because she has some, I think you may want to offer some question about timing or offer some insight to us about the timing of Emery, of the presentations or further information regarding Emery Grover. So let's start with Karis and we'll just call it an update regarding Emery Grover. Part of it is going to be to hear from Karis, and part of it will be, I guess, what we want to do with these list of questions. Okay.
So I did get to meet with the superintendent and the project managers on this after our last meeting. They have since put in a finalized plan, I believe, as part of the feasibility study. And that was a link that was attached to the agenda for that PowerPoint. They are still trying to get a feel as they try to figure out the total financial picture for what the contribution levels might be from CPC. I think they got some feedback at our last meeting, which was helpful. And they are planning on going for funding for design for our fiscal 22 process. So they would be putting an application in this December. And talking with the superintendent, he does want to come back and do a follow-up presentation. I think the recommendation I had was to do the presentation after the October town meeting and maybe at our first meeting in November of that cycle as we kind of move through these items and go through the town meeting process, which is a little later this year than normal. And he seemed to think that made sense. So there is a strong possibility that they will be looking for some design funding if they choose one of the 2 options that preserves the historic nature of the building.
Karis, do you want to fill us in a little bit on the financial side? Because I think that's relevant too, which is we're going to have Dave come in in August. Because everyone is everyone's raised this at different times. Laura, Artie, Rick, everyone, or a number of people have been, well, what do our finances look like when we get up and out of the other side of this first wave of the pandemic? So if you do you want to offer some information regarding that?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact that they're probably looking at is on the state match, less on our local revenues because we're funded through property taxes and we're not funded through things like meals tax or hotels tax like the general fund is. So what I've been hearing is sort of the concern is on the match side of things, and I've gotten very different information from different sources. So the Community Preservation Coalition put out an indication that they thought that the match this year was going to be about 13% based on their the revenues that they're seeing at the deeds registration and all the other items that get earmarked for CPC. The other side of it is I believe they passed some legislation last week to deal with a whole bunch of issues related to local and state funding and operations. And one of those items we were advised may impact that earmarked money and may make it available for the state to use to fund potentially their budget shortfall. So that's why Dave is indicating he doesn't want to come until August, because he's not going to have a lot of information he doesn't feel until August, particularly on that state match issue.
Sorry. Okay. Well, so with that, I think that what we should be doing is gathering information, right? So we might as well start doing it now. We have some resources to look at. So we'll have Dave come in August. We have a link, a 170-page document for us to read between now and our next meeting on the final draft of the Emery Grover review project. And I put together these questions. I guess I'm going to open it up for everyone. Do you want to review? I think these are good questions. Even we don't need the answers tonight. We don't need the answers August, but certainly there's no reason why we can't start getting additional information and be prepared for our meeting that we're going to have with Dan Gudenkantz in November. So I guess I'll open this up to everyone, but my thinking is that I took a crack at questions. We don't need to work through the questions tonight. I guess what I would propose is take a look at them, and if you have additional questions, why don't you communicate that to Karis, and let's start getting this information that we've asked for. Does that make sense? Let's open it up. First of all, let's ask Karis. Does that make sense to you, Karis, in terms of the timing? Is that a yes?
Yeah, I think I can send it to them now to start taking a look at, because some of these questions look simpler and some of these questions are much more involved. And with a goal of getting answers by the time the superintendent comes to present in the fall. Does that make sense?
Yes. Actually, one of the questions is, like, I have some scenarios that I asked Dave to run. So what is our last sheet of the 226, 20, I think, 22520 document. If we change funding to instead of 11, we change it to 7 or 5 or 2 or 9. What do each of those scenarios look like? So that's something that maybe, again, I don't want to. I want to be deferential to Dave. I don't want, but that may make sense for us to see in front of us. I don't know if we can do that between now and August, or if he has any interest in doing it between now and August. But I don't know if did anyone actually focus on that, which is that I asked Dave to give us different scenarios. What does it look like if we don't fund 11 million, but we fund 7 or 9, 7, 5, 2? I think that's how I did it. Rick, let's hear from you.
Yeah, Peter, the key assumption is going to have to be for David as he's going through these financial analysis is what kind of match are we going to get? The property tax percentage, the 2.5% for the CPA assessment, is fairly easy for him to calculate. And if you assume that they're going to do away with any match for at least the next fiscal year, and quite possibly for fiscal years going out in time, which is a likely scenario based on the state of the world, that's going to severely crimp our funds flow just based on the past analysis they gave us. So I think that needs to be factored in. Is maybe one of the other questions is what level, before you do that analysis, what level of funding is being assumed from the state? And you know, if it was zero, what would the answers be to those questions? 'Cause
Okay.
we may be.
So he may actually want to rework his entire spreadsheet, right, Karis?
Mhm.
Between now and August, he'll have some sense of where we're going for our next budget and the match from the state. And he may be able to rework that spreadsheet in its entirety. And so that's a good question that we have for him.
Yeah, because it's,
That is the question.
yeah, because it may just be for more than 1 year too. I
Correct.
mean, this might not be solved in fiscal year 21.
Okay. All right, and then I guess other than that, if there are items that you want, Rick brought up a good one. If you know of an item right now that you think we should be adding to the list that I put together, then let's hear it. Otherwise, you know, between now and the next couple of weeks, let's say 2 weeks, look through the document and forward to Karis any additional questions or additional information that you want in connection with this ask that's going to be presented to us pretty soon regarding Emery Grove. Okay. Make sense to all? Any questions? Comments? None. Okay.
Hey, Pete,
Yes, Artie.
I think we had talked about this before afterwards, and that was, you know, we have responsibilities, obviously being in the CPC, how we're spending our funds, but then, you know, how do our responsibilities flow into the community as far as how we feel about a project in general? Perhaps it wasn't phrased that way, but it was something like that. So for example, you know, do we put in there, you know, Rick, you had mentioned this last time, something about there are a lot of alternatives that are likely coming up for office space. Now, I mean, we're a wealthy community. In general, we're a wealthy community. We do very well, but there is a limit, and we do spend our money. And there is going to be a difference in the money that's coming in the future, not just in the CPC, not on the state side related to CPC. So at what point do we step back and say, you know, it's nice to pretend business as usual? I'm not saying we're exactly doing that, but to some extent. But at what point do we step back and say, you know, let's perhaps reassess and where we're going, and do we say, okay, what alternatives have been looked at for renting space, or leasing space, however you want to phrase it, some other space that would be extremely suitable for the school administration, for a heck of a lot less money, very likely a lot less money. Now, I know they've stated that they'd like to be in the center of town. I mean, I grew up in the town. My father grew up in the town. I mean, it's great having a lot of things that stay as is. I can appreciate that. But we do not have to. We do not have to pretend that it has to. We don't have to stay in that pathway. We can ask questions. We can ask questions where are the alternatives? What else can we do differently, which would still keep us a great community and perhaps even fiscally more healthy than what's being proposed. That's my statement right now.
So, Karis?
So I would just emphasize that I think the role of the CPC in this particular conversation is the investment in maintaining Emery Grover as a historic building. So even if the school committee decides to move someplace else and somebody buys the building, they could then come to the CPC for historic renovations as well. So I'm not saying that those factors aren't relevant, but the real consideration is it a good value for the CPC to invest in this particular historic structure?
Yeah, I agree with you. So, Artie, it's almost like you may actually have two votes, if you will. You know, in your role as CPC, you know, you're working your way through the statute and whether or not it's appropriate use of our funds. The broader question about whether or not we should be locating our school administration building here, that may be something that's more appropriate for the floor of town meeting and even for your vote at town meeting. So we are really focused on that historic artifact and the use of it. I understand your point, though, that whether or not it's an appropriate use, I would think it has to factor it in. It has to factor in some way. But I guess one way of approaching it would be the way Karis is saying it, which is that there's an unintended consequence of that is the building may be turned over, and then we're going to see a private developer coming to us for a substantial amount of money to pay for the historic preservation and restoration of that building, which, as I pointed out, not for nothing, it is on the National Historic Registry. It is a historic building. So I guess I don't have an answer for that, but I understand your point. Rick, would you like to chime in? Rick Zamboni.
Yeah, I'd like to just comment on what you and Artie have been talking about. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, and this is, I view it as where Artie's going. We're the overseers, the caretakers of the CPA money. And the question becomes, is the value there for the historical significance of the building? Do we want to spend, and let's use the number that they've been throwing out, $11 million to renovate a historic building, when really they're using the money and using certain loopholes, if you will, in the CPA Act to fund things that I don't necessarily consider historical, like the elevators or the roof. I mean, to me, it's like the same thing as you're looking at the church. We're looking at the outside of the building, and as long as the building facade remains the same, we shouldn't, and this is just my 2 cents, we shouldn't be paying for all those other things inside the building. That's, you know, even though it qualifies, it's not, the value proposition is not there. And so if we were to say to them, we're only going to give you $2 million, then they may be forced to look elsewhere. And if somebody applies and they want to convert it to condominiums, we may say, we're only willing to give you $2 million for the front of the building. You can ask for whatever you want, but we're the caretakers and the keepers of the CPA money. And it's within our oversight responsibilities to make sure we're getting value for that dollar on behalf of the taxpayer, is the way I look at it. So just my 2 cents.
Okay. Well, the other thing that you have to bear in mind is that the statutory language actually does allow for these kind of ancillary related systems to be part of the grant. And I would assume it's because you need to make it economically worth the renovators' while to go through the trouble. Because then what you would do ultimately, if you turn to everyone who comes to you and says, you're only getting $2 million, well, then they'll begin the process of demolition. So that, I think that's what you know, it may be somewhat difficult to do, but that's what happens. So I think they're trying, what they're trying to do is balance a lot of different things. But one of them is trying to make it economically worth a developer and owner's while to preserve the historic artifact. And that's why they brought it. Is it a loop, you know, is it I don't know that I would call it a loophole. It's closer to a lever than a loophole. It's a kind of a funding lever. You know, but one thing that we've had we're ready for a more robust discussion on is the actual percentage, right? Because we pushed that envelope. We pushed that envelope with respect to the preservation and restoration of Town Hall. And we had kind of an all-in, everyone was very enthusiastic about it, but we ended up paying through CPC funds, pretty high number. And people are using that as a model. So one thing that Bob Dermody has brought up is, well, is that the appropriate percentage? The only thing that I want to caution everybody on is that I think I think good governance includes some consistency. So you just don't want to be arbitrary. And unless there's some reason to overturn it, I think you want to kind of rely on precedent, because I think it's fairness is kind of an important component, and consistency is an important component. But I'm saying we should discuss it, but I just tell you that that's one of the principles that I think is important for.
Peter, I understand. I understand what you're saying, but if the precedent is bad, and we're not talking about Supreme Court justices here, if the precedent is bad, then we shouldn't just automatically go to that precedent. And I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but I thought it was close to 75% of the town hall monies came from CPA funds. That's a bad precedent. And I think that's probably the highest amount if you look at any of the CPA projects like that. So, I mean, across the state.
All right, that's well put. I understand that. Good. Those are good points. All right, Bob Dermody.
What was the dollar amount for the CPC funds for the town hall? Does anybody know that off the top of their head? And I know it's not a one-to-one comparison. Again, I'll thank my colleagues. I'll just leave that out there, and that's something we can look up. That's more for my own edification. Thank my colleagues again tonight. Another interesting way to look at this about the facade. As you probably may be aware, and personally, I'm in favor of trying to save this building. But I'm also our first responsibility is to the townspeople's money. So I think we need to be careful. I'm in favor of supporting it, maybe not at the amount requested. I think I've spoken up. I would like to have a shot at discussing with whomever makes the argument. It seems a little odd to me that people asking for money tell us what is valid or what is, under the law. That's their interpretation. And we don't have to match that. I would like to see us find a way to support it, but taking into account some other things people have said, other projects. I've spoken about this before. I'll say it again. I have concerns about the town using us as a checkbook, because they want to do this project. So I'm torn that way, because I want to do the project, but I don't think they should just say, oh, we'll get this money from CPC, and they write it down in a spreadsheet. So I'm cognizant of that. I don't know where I'm going with this stream of thought, so maybe I'll stop, but those are my 2 cents at this point. Thank you for your consideration, especially Mr. Gerstle.
Okay, so we are not a rubber stamp, and I think that we have sent that message rather clearly. And so you have a duty and responsibility to this committee and exercise your discretion, and it's your job. You were appointed by the selectmen to do that and to be careful with these funds, these precious funds, as they've been described. I think that those are, we can talk a little bit about percentage at some point soon. I also like having an architect on the committee. It's important. The proponents show up with their own architect. It gives us tells us what the number is, and they basically have baked in an expert. Okay, and we can consider doing one of two things. We can just kind of carve it back by percentages, probably the simplest route. We could get very particular and ask for detailed information about how it is that they came up with the number. Bob, I think that you asked that in our last meeting, and I've included that in our list of questions.
Thank you.
It sounds like the committee is very open to the idea of looking at the kind of a broad question about what percentage of the total project cost we're willing to put in as on behalf of CPC when it comes to historic preservation structures, especially projects of this size, right? Rick described us in our last meeting as a bank. I want to correct him on that. We never get our money back. We are a grant source. Okay, so that. We're not a bank. I wish we were a bank. Because I look forward to the VIG. Okay. We're not. Okay. All right. Karis had her hand up. Oh, Joe.
I was just going to point out Joe had his hand up.
Okay, good. Sorry, Joe. I
Well,
apologize.
no, that's okay. Just a quick point here. To Bob's point, I think that it would be great to have a bit of a refresher on what some of the proposed projects the town sees coming down the line. It'll allow us to make a more informed decision on whether, in fact, we want to bankroll some or we want to be more discreet in the amount of money that we fund Emery Grover. I think it seems as though the feeling is that everyone here feels that Emery Grover should be preserved, should be renovated, whatever they decide to do, whichever of those plans. But I think, as you've said, to the extent to which we get behind that is an important thing based on what we are going to be either not able to fund down the road or what is going to go by the wayside.
All right, Joe, that's a good question. I put together a series of questions in that memo that kind of address that issue.
Yes.
The way of putting it is, I mean, if we're going to say no, if we were going to say we're only going to give you $2 million, I think the last place we want this money to be is sitting in an account and gaining 0.01%. We're collecting this money. We should be using it for something. So if we're going to say we're not going to give you X, we'll give you Y. I think, in fairness to us and to the town, I mean, we can think about this. We probably want to have want to be able to articulate what it is we would do with the money instead. It could be as simple as we don't know what the future law is, and we're not interested in committing that kind of money on a 30-year bond. I don't know if it's 30 years. So it could be as simple as that. But I ask a series of questions like, are there any other historic structures in town that we think could be coming to us for a substantial sum of money? Is there open space? Is there something more than $1 million open space plot that we potentially have our eye on? And similar questions with respect to community housing. So what else is out there? So and so that we can get a good sense of what is up and over the horizon. We don't want to have kind of grantor's remorse, but at the same time, we can't just be the place where that says no, because actually we are a funding source. That's what our job is. But our job, I think, is to do it in a correct, deliberative way. That's the kind of way I see it, Rick.
Peter, just one other thought, just to kind of leave everybody with is, when we bond a project such as this, we have now committed the town to collecting the CPA money for the length of time that bond is in place. So if we're talking about a 20 or a 25-year bond, we've just committed the town to collecting CPA funds for the next 20 to 25 years. If, for whatever reason, the city of Boston decides to get into the game, or the state decides not to fund it and to repurpose the money, it's all we're doing is we're taking the taxpayers' money, and instead of putting it in the normal tax roll, we're just collecting a 2.5% surcharge, and we just committed to taking that over the next 25 years. And I fundamentally, from a financial perspective, I have a big problem committing future generations to that level of funding. And we're committing it by making this one decision. And I've always had a problem with using CPA money as a way to make a payment on 25 or 30 years of bonds. And I just, my own personal objection is we've locked in 2.5% per year for future generations. And again, that's philosophical about what we're doing. At some point, 10 years from now, someone on this committee may decide, or the town may decide, they don't.
You muted yourself, Rick. Rick,
Sorry.
that's all right. You were just
I don't know-
we were just
I don't know
warming
where I let
up.
off. I was on a roll and I got excited.
Yeah, you're warming up. You're just warming up.
Yeah, but I mean, my point being is that 10 years from now, somebody is going to say, maybe we don't want to spend 2.5% a year. Maybe we're overtaxing the people in this town. Maybe we have to tighten our belts. And we've just committed people to 2.5%, for the length of time that this bond is in place. So I just throw that out as another consideration, and that's beyond just this one project. So now I'll mute.
Okay, so it would be a bond. Any of those projects that are bonded are required to be approved by town meeting by 2/3 vote, and that's really kind of one of the reasons why we have the 2/3 vote for bonding projects, because we are making commitments going way out. It is something for everyone to consider, the committee and town meeting to consider, because it's a commitment. You're right. It's the equivalent of, and it's an override. It's not 2.5%, by the way. It's 2%, but it's a 2% override. And for actually bonding. I mean, this bonding is a very effective way of financing worthy projects. And so, what I take away from, I may disagree with you philosophically on some aspects of what you're saying, but not this, which is, this is not found money. This is not free money. This is a 2% surcharge that basically is permanently in place in our town. Net for each taxpayer, it's not a lot of money, but it's 2%. And when we sign on the dotted line for a bond project, that we're committing the town and the taxpayers to paying that 2% for those 30 additional years. And so we should be very careful of that when we make these, decisions. I think that's one of the things that I take away from what you're saying. Okay. Artie, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I hadn't really thought about everything that Rick had mentioned, but I certainly agree with much of it. And that was, it's certainly not free money, but in some ways it's a much easier funding source to get through the town, because you're just talking a 2/3 vote, and you're not talking an override. Now, granted, there are many worthy projects that we know we really like to do, and I suppose you could argue if they were put out there to the town to vote, perhaps people wouldn't be as viewing it the same way we would, or some other people in town meeting would, or something like that. But it's still the town's decision of what's going on. Now, granted, the town has elected the town meeting to make that decision, so 2/3. But I don't think people are really looking at it the way Rick is presented, and that is, we're committing for a very long time, because it doesn't really seem to impact us. Oh, it's a CPC money. It's there anyway. It doesn't have any impact on me. Well, it is. Every penny that's spent is our penny. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, how it's coming from. It is money that's coming out of our coffers. One way or another, it's coming out of our coffers. But it's very easy to be distorted and not understand that fact because of how the CPC is funded and how it's voted on. That in fact it does weigh us down in our generations to come. And I don't like doing that as well. I don't like spending money we don't have. At the same time, there are plenty of projects as governments, as a democracy. There are plenty of projects we should be spending, which then have to be funded for the future. There's no question about it. It happens all the time. Many worthy projects. But this funding is a very easy one to get caught up in and forget that fact that maybe every project doesn't fall into that category. So thank you, Rick, for presenting that way. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Artie. Anyone else want to weigh in on that philosophical point? I think but it's important. I want both, Rick knows this because he's been my wingman when I've gone to finance the FinCom. is that they are careful, and they pay attention to what these funding proposals are. And FinCom will be weighing in on Emery Grover. And so we should be scrutinizing it carefully as well. The question, if they become more difficult, these questions become more difficult when the amount of money coming from the state shrinks, because effectively, in the old days, it would be, look, if you put in 2%, you're going to get, 2% or 1% or some significant percentage back. That's an excellent funding source. Even when you bond, it's very creative. It's a very effective way of getting some things that we need. Town hall, restoration of town hall was a good example of that. But as the funding from the state shrinks, it becomes more difficult. So we're going to keep all that in mind as we go forward with Emery Grove, right? And so what I would say is take a look at these list of questions that I put together. I'll call them my initial due diligence questions with respect to the proposal, and pass along any additional questions that you have to Karis. And let's say you do it within the next 14 days, just kind of an internal deadline for us, so that she can pass those along to the individuals who have the knowledge and start providing us with that information. All right, make sense to all? Okay, great. All right, so now we're going to do a lightning round, liaison update, and further discussion. And let's start with First Baptist Church 2020-01. Bob Dermody. Robert.
Bob Dermody, thank you, Mr. Chair. After our last meeting, based on our discussion, I wrote an email to Reverend Darren at the First Baptist Church, re-asking the question I'd asked before that meeting, because I was concerned it wasn't construed properly, that I wanted to double check that she understood that we were asking very pointedly about their funding given the current situation of the general economy. I crafted the email, sent it, I believe, days after our last meeting in May, so around May 20th, I guess, maybe, and have not heard a word. No further comment.
Oh, okay, so you haven't heard back from her?
At all, whatsoever, okay. Which I find a little unusual, because every time I've ever emailed her since I met her, she has responded, and usually fairly quickly. So that's where we are.
Okay, I think we need to follow up.
Yep, I plan to do that.
Yeah.
Before the next meeting. Yep.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, thank you. And now First Parish Church. Any word, Joe? Any updates?
Not much. Bob and I spoke after the last meeting. I did reach out to Carl, who seems to be kind of the go-to man now that the pastor is still on maternity leave. They are still committed. They have complete understanding of the public hearing and the date of that. They said that the COVID-19 certainly had an impact on their congregation and to some degree on their financial situation, but it did not impact at all on their ability to go forward and to stick with the plan that they had, and hoping that we would be able to provide the amount of money that they had requested on their application. So other than that, I have not heard back any more from Carl or from the pastor.
Okay. Laura?
Sorry, Joe, do you know if they received any PPP money?
They did. They did receive some money from the CARE Act, I think that she referred to it as. He didn't say much, but it was a some amount anyway.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Now, Laura, I don't know. I know that you may have asked the same question with respect to the First Baptist Church. I don't know that we asked them that. And I can't recall if we had a discussion about whether or not we thought it mattered, if you will, if they received PPP or money.
I think to the extent
I have a question,
that
which is why do you think that that's relevant, other than just the broad question about what is your financial status?
I think it's relevant. It goes to one of the bullet points earlier. about having the funds to and the ability to complete a project. And if these places didn't get the PPP money, then they would be lacking. They wouldn't be able to make payroll. You know, it's all about like what your expenses are, which would affect their ability. They'd have to dip into their capital perhaps, and that might affect their ability to have the funds to complete a project.
Okay, I'm going to kind of push back on that a little bit because there are any number of reasons why someone may not have applied for PPP, including the fact that maybe they didn't get through to their bank. So I think the broader question is really what is their financial condition. I mean, it is helpful to hear that they got, you know, with the Unitarian Universalist Church, First Parish Church, well, they received CARES Act funding. You know, I guess I'm kind of shrugging my shoulders a little bit about how granular do we want to get. For example, with First Baptist Church, I'd like to know if more important to me is their tenant making lease payments. That's the more important, the most important.
I agree with that one. Yeah,
major funding source. But
I agree.
But I think that rather than put them, you know, I don't know that we need to do that. Maybe but I think we can say, have you been adversely affected as a result of the
right.
COVID-19? And maybe you could say, we're just curious, you know, did you receive any grant money? Did you receive CARES Act? You know, I guess we could ask that, but I'm more interested in a much more global question because I'm curious of whether or not they've got revenue coming in from their major revenue sources. And I remember the church, the major one being a lease that they have with a.
Right. I'm not suggesting it's a criteria. I'm suggesting that that if we revisit their financial situation, that might be a piece of it. That would be good to know.
Okay, good. Great. That's a good point. Okay, Bob?
Yes, thank you, Laura, for that comment. I do recall it from before. I'm of the mind that, you know, enough time has elapsed, and given that we've had a pandemic and, you know, the subsequent financial issues or economic issues, that we're revisiting all of their finances, you know, including the lease payment, and I think PPP would fall under it. So to be clear, in my email to the Reverend, I didn't use that terminology specifically. I just said your financial standing at this point, as we go through the summer, as we asked for it before, we asked for a financial statement. And basically, my mind is we're asking for an updated one because of the passing of time with the overlaying issues that I mentioned.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Okay.
And that's how I'll craft the next email.
Okay, I think that's a great idea. So that's great and a good point then, Laura. So we can incorporate that in. Okay. Okay, now, how about if we approach it this way? With respect to 03, 04, 06, and 07, do we have any liaison updates with respect to any of those applications? If you do, let me know. I will tell you that I do not. Okay, so no, we have no updates with respect to the balance of the grant application requests. And now we're going to move on to approving the minutes of our May 13th, 2020 meeting. Assume everyone has had an opportunity to review the minutes. How about if I make a motion to approve the minutes? Remember, I'm going to have to do a roll call vote on this. So that's a motion by the chair, Pingatore. Can I have a second?
Second.
By Chris.
I got there first, Chris.
No, I didn't hear you. Didn't hear you, Paul.
Chris Gersel was there first.
Thank you, Peter. I love you too.
He was on time for the meeting. So any discussion? All right, hearing none, let's have a vote. We'll do a roll call vote. Albert?
Aye.
Barnes?
Aye.
Artie?
Aye.
Okay. Dermody?
Aye.
Dorfman?
Aye.
Gersel?
Aye.
Zimbone?
Aye.
Okay, the motion carries, the minutes are approved.
Is the chair vote?
Oh, I'm sorry. I vote aye. Good point. Thank you.
Comment, please.
Okay. Yes.
I continue to be impressed, actually overwhelmed by the detail by which Kristen is able to gather everything that is said. You got to be careful what you say because you're going to see it in writing before you know it.
Yes.
Kristen's the best.
Kristen's work on minutes is just fantastic. When I was on the Housing Authority, I tried to interest her in coming over.
Thank you very much.
I couldn't lure her out over, but yeah, she's great. Yeah, fantastic work, Kristen. Always great work. Thank you so much. Okay. I'm going to put this under just other issues that have this is under things that have come to my attention, and it actually was brought forward to my attention by, I think Karis may have mentioned it, Laura certainly brought it to my attention, and this is something that we have to kind of talking about at some point. So I'll bring it up in the subject matter, and I'm going to let Laura talk a little bit about it because she deserves credit. And that is that in some communities that have been hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, they have used CPC funds under the community housing bucket for temporary rental assistance programs. And so Laura has brought that to my attention. And so, Laura, if you want to speak, you can. If you want me to carry the ball, I will. But what we want to do tonight is I want to bring that to your attention and talk about what we want to do about that. That subject is up. Laura's brought it to our attention. And what do we want to do with that as a committee? I'd have to kind of show you the framework of what we would do. It's not on the agenda, so I don't think it's fair to actually go into it in great detail, but I want to actually kind of lay it out as a subject that I think should be in our future meetings, because I think it deserves a fair hearing. So let's hear from Laura first, and I'll try and fill in, and then we're going to have Karis really fill in, okay? Does that make sense, Laura?
Sure. I don't have very much to say other than because Bank is familiar with Mass Housing Partnership, which is a nonprofit housing organization that provides first-time home buyer loans and counseling. We receive bulletins from them, and they share that they're aware of the fact that some communities are using CPA funds to support people struggling during COVID with rental housing payments. I'd be lying if I did a lot of research on it. I shared a link with Peter, which he already had. I know it would be complicated because it's not just us in a vacuum that would be administering it, but I just wanted to bring it to the committee's attention for maybe a future discussion, and maybe as a way of providing some background on it that maybe we could look into prior to our next meeting or so. That's all I really have to say at this point.
Okay. Well, I think that's fine. I think it's, my feeling on it is that we should have it as a discussion point at our next agenda for our next meeting. There is, Laura cut in and out, and I don't know if everyone had the benefit of hearing everything she said, but she mentioned Massachusetts Housing Partnership, which I think I stated correctly. And I believe actually they gave the town grant money, and they worked with us in doing the overlay district on the other side of 128. There's a housing component of it, but they're an advocate. They do various kind of consulting and advocacy and connect with housing. And with respect to the rental assistance program, they put together some best practices and some guides that towns can use. So there's some resources out there that they've developed, and their general counsel is a classmate of mine. But that's as an aside. So it would require, we're a grant source, right? not a bank. We give money away, but we also don't write the grants. So that would have to come from someplace else. We rely, in our town, we rely on the housing authority to be the kind of primary advocate for affordable house or low-income housing. I don't know if they have the bandwidth for it. I've seen other towns use housing trusts. Our housing trust is very restricted in nature. So there's just some questions about, well, who's going to ask for the money and how is it going to be administered? So Laura is somebody who's saying, as a member of the CPC, hey, this could be our housing bucket could be used for this. Is there any need out there and how would we do it? So that's how she brought it up. But I'll turn it over to Karis.
So just Peter, after you and I talked earlier today, I did, so I had mentioned this a while back to the finance director, and this does need to be approved by town meeting if we were to have this program. So I did give him a little heads up that we may have an additional article for October if this was something we were interested in pursuing. And I also have reached out to Lee Newman in the planning department. She supervises our housing specialist to see if this is something that would fall under that position. I know currently she's the one who administers the housing lotteries for 40B developments and for affordable housing for purchase. So I didn't know how that would fit, but I will definitely get information out to the committee before our July meeting. And I know Peter and I talked about putting it on the July agenda.
So what we're talking about is genuinely actually having a discussion about it at our next meeting. So it's not like we're making a decision. It's like, this is an issue that's out there. What is there a need for it in our community? Who's available? Because someone's going to have to be an advocate to us for the money. We happen to be coming up with the idea, but that's because the Community Preservation Alliance puts out different ways of using money, and they put out a recent bulletin, and they work with Massachusetts Housing Partnership to come up with best practices. Two things to note. One is that I sent an email to the current chair of the Housing Authority with this information and with an inquiry of basically, I don't know if you have the bandwidth or the interest in doing this on the Housing Authority side, but there's some interest from one of our committee members. That's number one. And then number two, there will be, in the next couple of months, I'm hopeful there will be someone who will replace me in the Housing Authority slot. So we could actually have someone from the Housing Authority here. Again, I don't know if this is the bandwidth. Because of various issues, we actually narrowed the scope of what we were doing at the Housing Authority. And at one time we were doing 40B compliance. We moved that over to the town. We kind of were trying to limit what our core competency was and to try and do it competently. So I don't know if this is something that they have the bandwidth to do. My suspicion is that they don't, and so it would have to come from some other organization. We don't have a ready built, we don't have a housing trust, and we don't have a community development corporation. That's kind of, we don't have a ready built mechanism for doing it. I don't know. So that's, we'll have to, we'll get some information, do some information gathering on our end. The good news is that we have good people in our planning department and just our town in general who are prepared to be advocates for people who, who are really in need. And this would be, this really is, helping people who would otherwise be losing their home or become potentially homeless. We would have to approve it at town meeting, so it kind of slows the process down. The entities that have done a good job with it, I don't know if I mentioned this, but Chelsea, I believe Chelsea and Revere, right? Which were the two hard hit cities for with COVID, were able to move quickly because they're a city form of government, so they can just kind of approve these kinds of CPC requests, as a matter of course. I don't know if it was Chelsea or Revere, but one of them had it. Okay. All right. So I don't know. Again, I don't think we need to vote, but it's a discussion item. We're going to ask Karis to do some research, and we'll get some information, and we'll figure out if there's any interest in the community for someone to come to us and make a proposal. All right, is it okay? Got it? Okay. So with that, I think we will adjourn. I can't recall. We have a vote okay, good. All right, so good. Let's have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Okay.
You're first, Chris.
God.
I seconded
Okay,
it.
so I
Oh, you
think,
first and you seconded, didn't you?
I think that Paul Albert was first and Artie was second. Okay, so, okay, we're gonna do a roll call vote again, and we'll start alphabetically. Albert,
Aye.
Barnes,
Aye.
Crocker,
Aye.
Dermody,
Aye.
Dorfman,
Aye.
Bristol,
Aye.
Zimbone,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. Okay, we are adjourned, and our next meeting is July 8th at 7:30. 7:30.